Hello and welcome to the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michaela, and today I have the pleasure to talk to Lauren Peate, founder and CEO of Multitudes. They're building engineering metrics without the creepiness. But before I start, let me tell you about my latest project, awesomecodreviews.com. Yeah, all my work on code reviews has now its own dedicated home. At awesomecodreviews.com, you find articles about code reviews best practices, code review checklist, news about the latest research on code reviews, and of course, workshops and courses I offer around this topic. So please hop over to awesomecodreviews.com and check out my latest work. But now back to Lauren. Lauren reached out to me after reading the paper of my recent study on developer experience. And she said she wants to talk with me about high-performing teams and a people-first way to software metrics. Lauren worked with tech teams around the world from Silicon Valley to Middle East and now New Zealand. As all of those are really topics dear to my heart, I'm super thrilled to have Lauren here with me to discuss. Lauren, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited. So let's go back to the slogan of Multitudes, right? It's engineering metrics that aren't creepy. And you promise on the website that the team, that you get ethical team, metrics like DORA, space, and so on. So really to improve the team effectiveness. How do you do that? What are ethical metrics for you?
Yeah. So I want to say first, we've recently revamped the website and we had a bit of a discussion around, okay, are we ready? Because we know it's a bold claim to say that we're ethical, to say that we're not creepy. So we did have a team discussion around, okay, first and foremost, do we feel like we've laid enough of the groundwork to be able to make that claim? And we do, which is why we landed on it. And I'll tell you more in a second about the actions we're taking. But the second reason we've put it on the website is because it's also an invitation to people to hold us accountable, because that's the bar that we want to be building towards. And so we want to have those conversations around how well we're doing that and where we could do that better. But yeah, so what are ethical engineering metrics? There's a quote I really love from Laura Taco, who's an engineering coach, where she talks about how engineering metrics, the key thing that either makes them creepy or empowering is where the locus of control is. So is it metrics that teams really are using for themselves to reflect back things, to make their own decisions? Or is it metrics that someone else is using to sweep in and tell people what to do? And obviously, much more empowering if it's something we can use for ourselves than something that someone else is using on us or, to tell us what to do. So that's the bigger goal with us at Multitudes is let's put these metrics in the hands of the team. So building in transparency is one of our key principles. The second thing we think a lot about is what are the guardrails for what we will and won't measure? And so we have a series of data ethics principles that have also shared publicly in the interest of accountability. And we go through a review process with any new feature where we say, let's test this. Let's get feedback from people in marginalized groups. Let's check the risk of harm. And out of all of that, one key thing that we've committed to is that we're not doing individual performance metrics. So we'll show metrics on the performance side around the team, but not around individuals. And then the last thing that I'll say is we are also being really thoughtful about the people that we bring in right now, where our product is still relatively young. We're in beta. And so we're intentionally in a closed beta because we're bringing in a filter. We have a values filter for the companies we work with to make sure that they are going to use it with good intent. And that also they're the kinds of people that we want to have shaping the product in these early days.
So I want to come back to the first thing that you said, which was, it's important who has access to the metrics, who uses them or abuses them, right? So, and you said transparency. So I understand that transparency means that the engineering teams know how they are measured or what is measured and, what goes into these metrics. But there's nothing that holds actually somebody else, let's say upper management, from still abusing those metrics, right? Even though we have transparency, we can still use that and do some ranking or, something like that.
Yeah, I hear that concern and, definitely something that we think about. So the first thing I would say is that's where for us it's really important. What are the metrics that are so high risk we just shouldn't even mention them? So there are no leaderboards on multitudes. There never will be. That's not, we know that stack ranking is a problem. So that's one thing, something like that. That's why there's no individual performance metrics. So none of this, like how many lines of code did you write, how many PRs did you do, because all of those for us, as you pointed out, even with the transparency, there's still just too much of a risk that someone could grab that and kind of use it in overly simplistic or reductive ways. So that's the first thing. There are just some things that we won't measure because it's not worth it. There's not enough value to compensate for the risk. The second thing is we have realized that we need to be a really opinionated product. So we're not going to be, we've occasionally gotten requests of, hey, can you just give me a CSV download and I'll play with the underlying data that you've aggregated and compiled. And that's not something we're going to do because we have opinions about what you do with these metrics. And one of our really strong opinions is that, especially because it's data about people, the metrics are the starting point for a conversation. They're not the answer. And that's because, we say this quite often, even if we had every single integration in the world, even if we plugged into every single piece of tooling that someone is using, because people are complicated, because we do things offline, it still wouldn't be the full answer. We would still always need to weave in that human context. And so there's things that we built into the product to tell people, hey, what's the human context here? And one example I can give you is we have these dynamic one-on-one guides where we raise some of the metrics that you might want to talk about in a one-on-one. So, for example, if someone's been blocked for a while waiting for a review, or if it often happens that they're blocked and waiting for a review, but we pair that with questions to ask the person. So it's an acknowledgement that there might be, the data might say, hey, there's something different or interesting here, but we still have to talk to the people that the data is about because they'll know more about why this happened.
Yeah, I really like this approach, and it reminds me quite a bit on the time that I worked at Microsoft. And there was always this request: give us, some data about people. And also in our team, we always said like team metrics is the only thing that we are actually assessing somehow, right? But also, I never really, I was never really into dashboards, especially not about people, right? Or some highlighting of some merged and summarized and aggregated and changed and so on data. I always saw it as an investigation, right? A little bit more from a researcher perspective. So you look at data, and I think data is so powerful, right? So it's a shame if we say we don't touch it because it's so risky. So we should touch it somehow, but it's very risky, right? So how do you touch it? And I like this idea of really asking questions. So when we went out to have some investigations, right, and we had aggregated data, let's say about code reviews, for example, and then you see, spikes or, something going on, most of the time it's not what you think, right? So you think like, for example, you're comparing, right? With data, you like to compare, right? So you want to know something higher, something lower, something faster, something slower, right? Something like this. And then you see, there's so many things going on in this project, but in this project there's a different cadence or something. So what's going on? And if you ask the questions, most of the time it's not as simple as you think, like, oh, they are slower, or there very often there's the context that really makes very understandable reasons, or gives you reasons why something is happening, right? So can you give me some more examples of where you have this context, or where you're asking for this context without jumping to conclusions with the metrics that you're gathering?
Yeah. Well, I'll say, so a couple things too. One of the other things we've been thinking about around that, and especially on this note of there's not going to be like a one size fits all, this is good for everybody. And so something that we're doing some really early prototyping experimentation with at the moment is around this understanding that what good looks like might be different for different teams. And also, one of the things, just on your point that you'd said at the beginning around how, sure, graphs are interesting, but no one's saying, oh, I'm so excited to look at a bunch of graphs today. That's not the why. The why is, at the end of the day, we want teams where people are valued, where they're thriving, where they're learning, and then ultimately where we're building great things together. And And so one of the things we're playing with is around teams, supporting teams to set their own goals and then helping them track their progress towards it. So having it be, again, it's a team conversation. Here's some data points, and then, what does good look like for us? What's our collective agreement around where we want to get to, and then how can we use a tool support people to kind of track that and get there along the way. And so that involves things like having check-ins where we ask people. So as part of the goal, you say, hey, this is something we're going to try to get us closer. And maybe the metrics didn't shift because we were too busy to try the thing that we were going to, or maybe it didn't shift because we did try the thing and it didn't work, or maybe we had trouble implementing it. And so those are some things where, as we build out this feature, we're proactively asking people to share that back with us and then weaving that in alongside the graph so people can kind of have that context next to the trends.
Yeah. So one question that I have for you as well is, I think metrics are always extremely stereotypical, right? So they measure the norm. They measure, what a software engineer or developer does. As we imagine this typical, stereotypical software developer that goes into work, and codes something, gets some, features, and then codes down these features and goes home, right? But in my experience, maybe there are, like, I don't know, I don't know really the curve of, how many people fall into that bucket of stereotypical, let's say, developer. But I know from my own experience, I have never, ever been this stereotypical developer, right? So I worked at Microsoft, and sometimes I had a research title, which is easier then, but sometimes I had a developer title. And so I was a software developer, even though I was not doing this typical feature work, right? I developed features, for example, for CodeFlow, which was the code review tool, but it was not my main task, right? My main responsibility. My responsibility was really to make studies, to see, data, what's going on with teams, with code reviews, to talk with teams, and all of that could not be measured. So if you go ahead and say, well, how many check-ins does a developer do, or when is the first check-in? You onboard that person, and you should have a check-in within the first week. All of that wasn't really, has never fitted to my role, even though the title said something. So how are you coping with that at Multitudes, and how many people actually fit into this, I think, very narrow scope of what a person typically does?
Yeah. Yeah, we see that. It's interesting. So we use the tool ourselves and we dog food it. And we see that because we have quite a few data scientists on our team. And sure, they're writing code, but similarly, their processes, if they're doing an exploratory data analysis, that whole workflow looks very different from someone who's got their thin slices of a new feature and they're just, churning out PRs. So yeah, we definitely see that coming through. A couple of things that we think about around that. So one, that's where, again, that team focus around what matters for us as a team, what are the goals that we want to get to, just to, that being a really key thing. And if I just go back to that example I just shared, of course, when we look at it, when we have the context, we know we shouldn't be comparing a classic dev team with a data science team because the work is quite different. Of course, those metrics should look different. So that's, again, kind of this team view, and instead thinking about, one, what matters to us. There's one of the things, and, we're just a small part of this, but it really feeds into this bigger conversation of the team norms and what does an effective team look like for us, and then what are the metrics that help us support that. And so for engineering teams, it's often things like, cool, we do want to be having smaller batches of work, we want to be moving along better. But for our data science teams, it might be more, hey, we want to make sure that we're getting really good collaboration on the different pieces of work because it's so early, it's so exploratory. We know we need a lot of different eyes on it. And so that in practice might mean that there's different measures that you would look at. Maybe for one, you're thinking more about a lead time, or another, you're looking more at the breadth of reviewers that you're getting on each of your pull requests. So I guess, it's similar to, as you pointed out, because of the diversity, I'll go back to this point of, it really is about what are the conversations that we're kicking off, and then teams kind of deciding for themselves which are the metrics that matter most for the goals that we're trying to achieve as a team.
Yeah. And then also when we come back to data, we only can measure what's somehow happening in the software systems, right? In the engineering systems, everything that happens outside. And I would claim that's quite a bit, right? That's a lot of work happening outside of those systems that we can trace and track and analyze and so on. What happens to that work? Often it's glue work, but not only, right? It's not only glue work. It's somebody standing on a whiteboard talking to a colleague, and they're sketching out something. It's something that happens at the coffee machine where we are talking, or maybe it's happening over Zoom, right? Because we are remote and so on, but we are not tracking Zoom and so on. So what happens to all those conversations, and how do they fit in? Is it enough that we just look at what the engineering system tells us, or do we sometimes get blindsided by that, and how can we overcome those problems here?
Yeah. So this is one where both the remembering that the data is the starting point for a conversation, but then also thinking about the diversity of data that can be helpful to paint a more full picture. So something we think about a lot is, so we're really interested in what's the employee experience, and of course there's a whole diverse set of data we can use there. But an analogy we like to look at is what's the different types of data that we weave into our product development processes. And so if we look at that, we know we've got the very in-depth one-to-one user research, really high touch. We're talking to people. We can get lots of depth. We can understand the why, but also the volume is going to be more limited because it's so time consuming, right? So we've got that.
Mm-hmm.
We've got our surveys, and we can do our NPS or other types of satisfaction surveys, and people can tell us, hey, I liked it, I didn't like this. And then we have all of our digital analytics of, okay, where did they drop off? Where did they rage click? What was frustrating people? And then we use that to kind of piece it together and then give us some clues about what we might want to do next. And so we see ourselves fitting in to the suite of that and the employee experience. And if you look at it, we've got our one-to-ones. Great leaders are always doing one-to-ones, and lots of reasons why. So that's the in-depth stuff, but smaller volume. We've got our engagement surveys, and I know you're involved with DX. The developer experience surveys, so useful because then people are telling us how they feel about something. We don't know that unless we ask them, so that's really
Mm-hmm.
important. And then rounding it out with some of the behavioral data, which is also coming in the background. And we're looking at a range of things like who might be at risk of burnout because they're working long hours, or who's getting less feedback and support on their work, or that question of where the work's getting blocked. And so it's what's the diverse set of data sources that collectively give us different pieces of the picture, and then always bringing in the humility of, even with all these different data sources, people are complicated, they change, they do things offline. And so always remembering that it's a hypothesis, and then we have to talk to people to really test it.
And how do you transfer this humility to somebody else, right? Because you as a team can have it and you can build it somehow in your product. But then on the other hand, it's out of your hands, right? So you have the data. How do you remind people, educate people, teach people to have that humility, and also to know that those metrics are not the ground truth, right? So how do you remind them of that?
Yeah. So another thing that really matters to us. So I'll run through kind of the suite of ways that we think about it. One is having those questions alongside the data. So the nudge, hey, this is part of the picture. We even in those one-on-one guides I was mentioning, visually, it's the graph takes up half of kind of the space, but the question and the space for both people, so the engineer and their team member, and their manager to share their thoughts, is the other half. So even visually, we're trying to say, look, like it's equal in terms of the importance of these two things. So weaving in those questions, then those kinds of nudges to add in the context, that's one of them. The other thing that we're doing is in the near term, I mentioned we have this closed beta, and so we are only bringing in people where it's more confident. And then one of the things that we're testing along the way, there's always, as you point out, kind of, hey, we think people are going to use it this way, and then they use it in different ways in the real world. And so what that means is we have a trusted group of early folks who we can start to see how they use it in the real world. And we actually have had features. We had one in particular I can think of where it was pretty much done, and we started to put it in the hands of people, and then we were like, no, we're not in us looking at the actual usage data, so our own digital analytics on our app.
Yeah.
It wasn't being used in the ways that we thought it was. So we actually have had one in particular that got all the way out, and then we pulled it back. And so there's kind of those checks even at the very end. And then the last thing I'll say is on that accountability side, we actively seek out academics and activists and people who are really close to how our system is causing harm. Especially one of the things we think about a lot, we know that people from marginalized groups have even like more examples of how data has been used in harmful ways against them. And so actively showing our product to those people. We had a call earlier this week where we said, hey, tell us the risks, like let's talk through it. And so wanting to make sure that we're getting those other eyes, because of course we can have our own kind of assumptions, and we want to make sure that we're testing those.
Yeah. I got a question yesterday on Twitter about mob programming, ensemble programming, right? Where you program as a group, a pair programming, but really people are nowadays focusing very much on this mob and ensemble programming. And if I think it's better or same as code reviews and how they compare and so on. And I know that some people really love mob programming, ensemble programming, right? So what do you think about this, and how does that, come back to the engineering metrics that we see, that we measure, right? Especially synchronous, asynchronous work styles. I think they show very different in the metrics. They can, set up our, metric system a little bit. Like, do you think, wow, some outliers here, right? Michaela, what is she doing on the weekend here? Maybe she's burned out. or she's not checking in something at 3 p.m. Like maybe should put her on a pip or something, So what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah. We're seeing, as you were talking, I was just thinking of kind of the range that we're seeing across all the companies we're working with. And it's a pretty broad range. And we see some teams where they love mobbing, ensemble programming or pairing. I would say, excuse me, we've especially seen it be really helpful as part of the onboarding process, one. So quite a few of our companies, maybe their normal isn't to do pairing, but when they have a new team member, then they say, yep, sweet, this is how we're going to get you up to speed, is you're going to pair with someone who's been around for a while. And then, you're kind of getting a bit of a guide to figure out your way through the code base and all that. So that's one we've seen quite a bit. Another place where we've seen it be really helpful is sometimes when a team is, maybe they're trying to do a bit of a reset about how they do collaboration. And we've seen this sometimes happen as a company is scaling. Maybe in the earlier stages, people were working more independently. It was very just like, the product was small enough, the code base was small enough that you could just say like, you do this, you do that. We kind of have our areas. And then maybe as they're growing, no one has, can really know all the things anymore. You need to kind of be getting more of those sort of that feedback from other people about kind of how it might impact other parts of your product. And so we've also seen that pairing be really helpful for kind of the like cultural shifts at those times when you're trying to say, look, we want to just do a bit of a reset to say we're gonna be doing lots of feedback. And so to kick it off, here's a moment, here's a period where we're doing a ton of feedback. So those are a couple specific examples where we've seen it be especially helpful. But yeah, we're definitely seeing a whole range. And then shifting to your question around, well, what does this mean for the metrics? It's something that we've been mulling over because we know there is this rise in pairing and mobbing, and we really love the benefits that it can have for knowledge sharing. It's not within GitHub today, there's not easy ways to see that. So to be really honest, it might just end up us being at some time doing a feature request to them to say, hey, pairing and mobbing is a thing. Can you have a way of acknowledging that? But in the near term, one of the things that we do have is issue tracking data. And so there it can be a little bit easier, at least to see if a couple people are picking up a ticket. So that's one way to see it. And then another thing that we're thinking about, and I will say this is something that is, it's still an area we're mulling over and is more future focused for us, but it could even just be a little context note that people add, as we're thinking about what's the context on these pieces of work. It could be that maybe two people were pairing and it was consistently one person who was the main PR author. Maybe it's that new team member, the more experienced team member, and they had the new team member kind of take the lead. We're thinking about, okay, well, maybe that's just another context note that we include on the data to say, sure, it looks like this person dropped off in their work, but actually it's because they were working closely with this other person.
Yeah. So when you tell me all of that, and I'm getting a little bit a better picture of the metrics, but maybe in the next question we really deep dive a little bit what the metrics are. But what you're also telling me is that it seems like a lot of work to work with this system, right? So you have your data. I think a lot of people that go for metrics, they want this, I click a button and then there is the answer, right? So for me, this seems very involved. I have to be very intimate with the system, right? I have to be very close with the system. I have to look at the data. I have to make those notes, right? Which for me seems a little bit like leaving comments in code. uh, are people doing it? And how much work is it to leave those notes and say, oh, actually, system, you don't know, so I know, and I'm really extracting my knowledge and put it in the system, write it down.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. So a couple of things. One, because we're pulling in passive data, once the integrations are set up, it's no work to get the insights. We're surfacing it and saying, hey, here's the things that are popping up that are interesting. And in practice, those types of context notes, one, our first goal is how do we help highlight where people should be spending their time? So our goal is it's not, hi, here's 20 graphs and you have to look at all of them. We're always working on how can we do a better job of surfacing the things that we think are going to be the most interesting for you to focus on right now. So that's one. What's the stuff that there's been the biggest change? Maybe if you've set a goal, it's furthest from your goal. And then the second is on those areas where it's a question or there's context pieces that really just pops up for the critical things. So a lot of the time, especially our tool, we're first and foremost thinking about a team using it for themselves. So a lot of times they have that context. It'll be a manager or a team member will look at it and they'll already know, like, yep, cool, these two people were working on this piece of work. And so those contact notes, it's really more for teams that are thinking about how someone else who's not on the team, if there's like a senior person they're going to be having a conversation with, that's where the context note starts to become more important. But yeah, in the day-to-day, to be honest, it's it doesn't require the effort, but for the teams, for us, what's important is the teams that are worried. If there is a team that's like, hey, we want to make sure that this data isn't used against us, the context is really the answer. For the teams that are in really high trust organizations and there's less of that worry, the context, people can kind of trust that, no one's going to make a reductive decision off of these metrics. And so there's less of a need to put that time and effort into all the context.
Okay, yeah. So we talked about the metrics. I want to know what are the key metrics, and then what are the metrics that most people use, right? You also said that you have analytics inside, and I think especially as a startup, right, trying to figure out where to go. You probably have a lot of knowledge about how they use your systems, what do people really like, which features do they not use so much. So probably also which metrics are, maybe in your thought, the most important ones, and then does this deviate a little bit from what you see actually that people use, or how is the usage of this matrix?
Yeah. So the top buckets that we have is one around how the work is flowing and where it's getting blocked. And with that, we've really leaned on the DORA research because you don't need to reinvent the wheel there. And then the counter to that, so that's more of the process side, as we like to call it. And then on the people side, we've got metrics around well-being, so indicators of who might be at risk of burnout, and also around the support that people are giving and also receiving on their work. So that's high level, and I'll dive into the deeper part of it in a second. One thing I will say, though, is so DORA, of course, has been around for a while, and then the space research that came out, it was lovely because what we'd been doing in the background is on the process metrics side, we'd been really leaning on the DORA research, and then on the people metrics side, we'd been leaning on a few different research sources. And so what was so lovely is now there's actually one paper that has that broader picture that we can point to. And of course, we're still leaning on the other research as well. But we really love that as an encapsulation of this holistic picture that we're trying to show of not only how are we doing in terms of getting the work done, but how are we doing in terms of how we treat each other. So
Yeah,
I'll give a couple.
maybe we can tell my listeners a little bit what them DORA metrics are, because a lot
Oh,
of people
sure.
know it, right? But I think just to highlight for them what it means, right? It's lead time, right? This means also how long does it take something to reach the code base, right? It's time to failure, right? Or to recovery, right? How, if you have an error, how fast you come back. What else is there in DORA?
Yeah, lovely. We like to think about them as two of them are a little bit more on the kind of speed or quantity side, and the other two are a little bit more on the quality side.
Mm-hmm.
So exactly as you were saying, we've got lead time. That's thinking about from when we start doing the coding until we get it in the hands of customers. How long did it take? So
Mm-hmm.
in practice, it's usually first commit out to like how long it takes from there to time to getting in production. So that's lead time. Then deployment frequency. So that's how often we're getting something in the hands of our customers. So you can see both of those are really on what's it going to take for us to get that value in the hands of the end user who's going to really benefit from it. And then more on the quality side, the two metrics there are change failure rate. So how often when we release a change does it end up failing? And then the second, as you mentioned, is mean time to restore. So exactly when it fails, then how long does it take us to get that system going again? So yes, really lovely set of metrics. What we loved about it, and people see this in the research, is they're metrics that are linked with the financial performance of companies, but also with the psychological safety of teams. And so it's this real nod to what we know from other research about how an effective team is one where there's trust and that psychological safety between team members. So that's on the process side. And I would say that out of those, one of the ones that people are looking at the most often is lead time. And then we have a few different things we built in to let people to start to dive deeper and diagnose where might it be getting blocked? What might the blockers be? Where can we start to shift things? So that's the biggest one on that side. And then on the more people metric side, we look at a couple things. So one is how often people are working outside of the hours they want to be working. So that's an important phrasing. Yeah,
me.
That's so interesting. But this one is one we've been doing some tweaking around, and there's a lot more we want to do with this one in the future, I will say too. But because people work so flexibly, we see so many people who are doing I do some work and then I took the dog for a walk and then I did some more work and then the kids got home from school and we did dinner and bedtime routines and then I did some more work and these like interesting patterns. There's a great article recently that said we've gone from bimodal days, so sort of work in the morning, lunch, work in the afternoon, done, to trimodal days because now you're juggling in all sorts, even more life things. So yes, we're absolutely seeing that. And so at the moment we say, hey, tell us kind of like what are the concerning patterns for you? And then that's what we'll highlight. One of the things that we'll be weaving in even more as we go is that learning of, well, what is your normal? Maybe you think your normal is one thing, but actually in practice, your normal is something else. So that's on the roadmap for that well-being metric of actually reflecting back to you, these are the patterns. And then, one that might be an insight for you, but then two, just flagging the work that happens outside of whatever your normal is. So that's the well-being side. And then on the collaboration side, so looking at who's giving lots of reviews on other people's work, this is an example of something we really care about, which is glue work. So the work that, and many people are often familiar with this, but just in case, glue work is the work where it's not necessarily the like, I built this, hey, I achieved this outcome all on my own. Glue work's the work that makes everyone's collective effort better. And so it might be the reviews, it might be coaching and mentoring others, it might be doing documentation, it might be facilitating meetings and making sure people are clear on follow-ups. So, there's a whole mix of kind of human and technical things that fall in that bucket. And we know that people from marginalized groups are both more expected to do that glue work and less appreciated when they do it. And the other thing is that leadership is essentially glue work. I mean, as a leader, you have less and less time to actually go do the building yourself, and your job starts to become more and more, how am I amplifying others to do their own building? So for a bunch of reasons, for fairness reasons, and also because it's important, we're really thinking about and already have these indicators around who's doing the reviews. Let's go celebrate those people who are contributing a lot to the team in that way. So that's one. The other one we look at is who's the feedback received, and in particular, who's getting much less feedback. And so, we know that getting less feedback, it can mean that we're not getting the code to as high quality of a position. We might not be catching things. It might also impact that person's own learning and development if they're not getting the same feedback opportunities from their peers. So that's another thing we want to make sure it's really fair and that feedback is going across the team. And then the last thing, and this is one of our favorite pieces of analyses, is then showing the patterns of feedback both between teams. So is there a team that's a silo and is often working on their own? Is that expected? Maybe it's expected, but maybe it's not. And then within a team, what are the patterns of who's supporting whom? We were just having a conversation with someone today around how they've noticed that there's a couple people who are kind of almost becoming their own sub-team. And so they want to have more of a spread of interactions across the team because they want to make sure there's that knowledge sharing across everyone, not kind of embedded within a couple people. So anyway, those are all types of trends that we see people looking at. And on the people side, it really is the metrics around the patterns of how we're giving and getting support that we see people looking at the most often there.
Yeah. So for the process metrics, which are following DORA, right? I totally understand the team aspect, right? But for the personal or for the human side, it seems that even though you said you're looking at the team and only at the team, it seems that those are all individual metrics, right? So it's all a metric about you and how you do and how what are your work hours, how much feedback do you give and receive. So it's not really a team metric anymore, right?
So that's a good clarification, which is we don't show any individual performance metrics. So anything on the process side that starts to look at like the work that I did, more of kind of the output. Yeah, exactly. Like, so we don't do, if it's like PRs, lines of code, that type of side, we don't do it at the individual level. The people metrics, because they're much more around who are we going to support, who's overloaded, those ones we do show at both a team and an individual level. And so the types of insights at a team level might be, I mentioned that one where we're looking at the patterns of interactions across teams. We might see that a team is siloed and isn't having lots of interactions with other teams. And so that might be something where, and again, could be expected, but could be not. Maybe we have shifted the type of work they're doing, and we actually expect them to be collaborating more closely with another team. Yeah. So we've got those team level metrics. And then we also, as you noted, have it at the individual level. And that's very often, one, it lets us celebrate. So that glue work example, we want to celebrate the people who are putting in what is often very unseen effort to lift up others on the team. That one of our goals is to really highlight that. And then we also want to highlight if someone's not getting the same growth and development opportunities because they're not getting as much feedback as others.
So what are the signals that you're using? Because, one is code reviews, right? So who participates on code reviews, who reviews, who gets feedback, how much, and so on. So I understand that. But what are some of the things that you can measure to measure the glue work, right? So if somebody sets up a meeting or, makes sure that everybody is on time, sends around an email for that, do you have like your probes everywhere in my email system? Do you have it in my Zoom or in my Teams, or what kind of monitoring is going on here that we get this data? So what can I expect here?
Yeah. So we're an early stage product. So at the moment, we've got both Git analytics and then also issue tracking data. We have a Slack app, but that's more for the kind of alerts and nudges going out on the behavioral side, although we will flip it and do a Slack integration as well. So that's kind of what we've got on that side. And on the glue work, some of the other integrations that we will be adding on that are in the roadmap are around who's updating our documentation, so our wiki, who's making sure that that's all up to date. That is another one that we're really interested in. Something else as we weave in that Slack integration will be things like who's kind of doing the roundups, chasing up people on like how things are going and updating people there. So there's a few that are coming in the near term around that as we kind of add our extra integrations.
Yeah, really, really cool. So when you reached out, you said to me, we should make sure we are not focusing on the 10x engineer, but the 10x team. So I'm obviously very curious. What is a 10x team, right? What are some signs of a 10x team? When is it a 10x team?
Yeah, I love this. So for me, there's two key things that need to be in place for a team to be 10x. And actually, let me just back up. So many people might be familiar with this trope of the 10x developer. It came out of, there was some research, it was in the like late 70s, early 80s, where they'd done some measures of different developers and found that, some developers, and mind you, this was, even their metrics were reductive themselves. So they were looking at, I think it was along the lines of things like lines of code and anyway. And so they were saying, cool, yep, some developers, they just do 10x the output work from other developers. And so it's quite an old trope. Some of it is a little bit outdated. And so the 10x team one, the first thing I'll say is we know, for example, from the DORA research that the teams that are doing the best on some of those metrics, not only are they 10xing the teams that do the worst, some of the stats are pretty absurd. So lead time and mean time to restore, the best teams are 6,000 times better on both of those and faster than the ones that are doing the worst on them. So, we've gone with 10x team because it feels very achievable, but in fact, some of the research shows that it can go way beyond that, which is great. But yes, how do we get to be a 10x team? So for me, there's two key hallmarks. One is we have high expectations. And then the second is that we have high support to help people meet those expectations. And so as you might imagine, a lot of this is the really human work. On the expectation side, a lot of that is around the clarity. So things like growth frameworks are really wonderful for helping set the expectations of what does development look like in this organization. That's also where us practicing our skills of giving really kind but clear and candid feedback is helpful too. So yeah, that's the expectation side, and also the expectations. There's kind of expectations for individuals, but also expectations for us as a team or for us as a company. And so, what really does success look like across those? And we've got tools like OKRs, or at a company level, thinking about what's the bigger vision of what we're building. So that's that side, and then the support side. It's knowing, it's really an acknowledgement that we can't go after big things unless we know that there's going to be people who are going to back us up, because when you go after big things and you do big challenges, sometimes it's going to fail. It's not going to work. And so the support side is everything from creating an environment that's inclusive and equitable. For us at Multitudes, we're trying to do a good job of kind of sharing our work and practice. So we shared a few blog posts about what that's looked like. But one of the examples for us is having regular training on topics around equity and inclusion. So like colonization and the history of it, and how it's impacting us today. Sometimes some topics that are pretty big topics. We're talking about white supremacy at work, and and again, these are big topics, but we would rather talk about it, and we think it's important to face these things to make sure we are creating an equitable environment. So that's one example, but also support is the soft things like, do we have a flexible workplace? And you gave such a great example earlier of how what helps you thrive at work is not like hours on a call or hours in the office. And what's amazing is you're super clear on what helps you thrive at work and what you need to do a great job. And so it feels like such a clear win these days. Of course, we should give people flexibility because we do have different ways that we really succeed. So yeah, in brief, that's kind of the high level how I would lay it out.
Maybe coming back to the last thing that you said, I'm thinking about this a lot, right? And I think the only way why I can be so clear about it is because I'm self-employed. So I'm my own boss, right? And I really have to think about myself and get on track with myself. But what I'm saying is that I think flexibility is really good, and I hope that more and more companies will understand that. I think we are going some way there, but I don't think we are quite there yet, right? So I think there's still a lot of stereotypical thinking what means to be productive, right? And coming back to this really old thinking of when I'm in the office in my chair, then I'm productive, right? Which is so far-fetched, right? I was working at a large company during my study time, and then it was one of those very controlling companies. So you weren't allowed to have any stickers somewhere or pictures somewhere. So very clean desk policy. All desks were somehow facing others so that everybody could watch your screen if you're not doing something that's not work,
Oh,
right?
wow.
We had like white lists of websites that we could go to and not other
Yeah.
websites because they're all blocked, right? So that you really do
Yeah.
your work. And then what actually happened is that people were in the server room, doing some stuff, hiding in there to get their fair share of downtime and so on. So I don't think
Yeah.
people were really productive. I actually think it's the least productive company I ever worked with, right?
That's
Or
so
for.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
not surprising. Yeah. Yeah. And also, that server room example, people will find a way.
Yeah, yeah,
You can
exactly, right.
like, yeah, just better to, and I think this is where clarity of expectations helps too, because to me, to be honest, it's a lazy management approach to say, we're just going to look at the number of hours that I could see you sitting somewhere working, instead of saying, actually, what we care about is that we achieve these outcomes as a team. And this is your role in
Yeah.
helping us achieve those outcomes. And then if you help us get there, it shouldn't matter what time of day you did it, or even the hours that it took for you to achieve that thing, because people work differently, and we want to appreciate that. And so, yeah, I think that's where I think if we say, like, actually, this is what we care about, this is where we want to get to as a team, it takes a little bit more work, but it's just it then allows more flexibility than the old rigid, I need to see you sitting here 8 hours a day, and that's how
Yeah.
I know you did your job.
And I think it also, I mean, it's a little bit of burden for let's say, the company, or maybe the founder, the CEO, right? The leadership team to really think, what's this worth, right? So I want to, and thinking about outcome, I want this feature. What is the worth of this feature? I want this blog post. What's the worth of this blog post, right? And this comes
Yeah.
into, maybe that's why I'm saying self-employment is much better, because we are more thinking about those things, right? So if I'm making a contract with somebody, they tell me, this is, what it's worth to me, and then I say yes or no. And if I put in 10 hours, I put 10 hours. If I put 100 hours, I put in 100 hours, right? And so this is a little bit of a different conversation, and I think it would be just fair to also have that at companies, maybe. And
That's interesting. Yeah.
and I think that maybe quite some people would earn quite much more, right? Because they
Yeah,
are
yeah,
valuable to
yeah.
the company and so on. But yeah, anyway, this is a
Yeah.
completely different conversation,
No,
and
it's
we are going.
interesting.
Yeah, go
Oh, the
ahead.
last
Yeah,
thing I'll say on that too,
yeah,
though, is I think that's also where, so I sort of glossed over it, but one of the pieces of research, it's been around for a while, but honestly, it's becoming a classic, which is the Project Aristotle research around why psychological safety is so important. And essentially, long story short, Google, so they noticed that, same high hiring bar across the company, but some teams were just performing so much better together than others. And 2 years of research and looking at 200 teams later, this is Google, the number one thing was the amount of psychological safety on that team. And I think part of it too is when there is that safety, when there is that trust, I feel so fortunate that like I love my team because I can really lean into this, with when we can lean into this together. And it's just when there is the trust, you just know people have got your back, that they'll understand that you tried your best, and even if it, that thing didn't work, that they're not going to judge you for it. They'll see you're striving. And we don't lose time then doing these kinds of, these like funny rules, or having to work around funny rules. And so I think it just, like, the trust and the psychological safety, it's actually just, it's kind of like a lubricator for everything else to just make the rest go more smoothly.
yeah. I think so too. I think it's probably the most important that you can just be upfront and talk about what you really feel, and how it's going, and without thinking that you will be punished, which is sort of the bottom line of psychological
Yes.
safety, right? And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I totally see that. And I have been at many different workplaces. Psychological safety hasn't been always top of mind, right? And I think, I
Yeah.
mean, here in Austria, which is culturally, again, it already starts with school. School is not a very high psychologically safe place, right? And
Mm.
it goes further with university. It was not a psychologically safe place, right? And so from
Wow.
that, you're entering workspace not expecting, and I think just with
Yeah.
with age, I learned that actually it's something that I can expect, right? That I can also ask for, or that and it's a privilege as well, right? Because if you need a job, you need a job. You just have to
true.
go and work there. Yeah.
That's so true. Yeah.
Well, Lauren, thank you so much. We are really on time now. I don't want to, to take more time than I promised that this will take for you. So, is there something that you want to share with my listeners? Something that they should take home, especially looking at metrics? Maybe some, like the key thing that you would say tell them about metrics and how they should use it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things. One, really should all start with the like what matters to us. The metrics are simply a way for to help us get indicators and signposts of how are we doing at the things that measure that or what that matter to us. So that's the first one, and the second is that see the metrics as the starting point for a conversation rather than an answer. And it doesn't have to be every metric we need to discuss, but the metrics that are the most surprising or different, those are the ones where whatever the conversation is, it'll probably help us surface some interesting things that have been going on for our teams or with the underlying data. So yeah, that's my key takeaway. And yeah, we're in, if you're a values aligned organization, if you're an engineering leader who cares about people, we do have a beta where we're bringing in a group of people who are values aligned to give us that feedback.
Yeah, cool. So I have a last question for you, but then we really cut it short.
Okay.
What about project-based metrics? Because this is something that I normally recommend, right? So I'm not saying, oh, this is the set of our metrics that we look now on for the next 10 years, but more like, we are discussing and we think code reviews suck right now, right? So now we are getting a bunch of metrics that we think are valuable and we track them, let's say for half a year. And then we really do some action in this area. And when we feel better with our code reviews, we toss those metrics. We don't need them anymore. And we take some other metrics, take some other pain points that we are feeling, let's say about, failure time or, time to recovery or something. And then we work on that for half a year or whatever it takes, right? 3 months. And then we toss those metrics away. So this is how I normally work with teams. Do you see people do that? Do you recommend that?
Yeah, I love that. So we're seeing people do that in practice. We could do a better job of supporting that with our product. That's something we've talked about, is actually kind of the like basically doing an upfront question of what are you most focusing on, and then having the like your whole flow through the product really shift based on what is your number one goal today. So something that we really want to support more. But yes, in the meantime, we do see people kind of like shifting their focus within the product, and I love that. And the reason I love that is because it's such a sign of success. When I was early in my startup days, someone told me once that there will always be problems, but success is that the problem has changed. And so this feels like such a great example of that is, yes, we had something we were worried about, but at least we got that to shift. And now we've earned the opportunity to go worry about something else.
Yeah, I love that. That's really nice. Thank you so much. Well, Lauren, thank you so much. Thank you for being on my podcast. I really enjoyed talking to you. I could go on and on, so let's just stop here. Okay.
Thank you. This was such a pleasure. Thanks for all your great work.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This was another episode of the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please help me spread the word about the podcast. Send the episode to a friend via email, Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever messaging system you use, or give it a positive review on your favorite podcasting platform such as Spotify or iTunes. This would mean really a lot to me. So thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will talk to you in 2 weeks. Bye.